They told Thomas Graves the decommissioned submarine was completely stripped. Every classified system removed before the Navy approved it for civilian sale to be turned into a museum exhibit that would never dive again. But when he was doing a structural survey 3 weeks after paying $600,000 for 4,500 tons of nuclear submarine, he found a sealed compartment that didn't appear on any blueprint, contained equipment that was still drawing power from somewhere, and had a door mechanism that looked like it had been accessed within the last 72 hours, which meant either the Navy had made a catastrophic security failure, or someone was still using this supposedly retired vessel for purposes that were never meant to be discovered. He bought a Virginia-class submarine, then found a room the Navy never listed, a room that connected him to his father's disappearance 28 years ago, and exposed a program so classified that admitting it existed would require rewriting everything the public believed about American submarine operations. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, smash that subscribe button right now and tell us what state you're watching from in the comments. We love hearing from our viewers across the country. Now let's get started. Thomas Graves was 52 years old and had spent 30 years building a maritime museum empire that stretched across 7 states. His facilities housing everything from World War II destroyers to Coast Guard cutters to merchant vessels that told the story of America's relationship with the sea. He'd started with a single tugboat purchased at auction in 1994, gradually expanding through careful investments and shrewd negotiations until his Maritime Heritage Foundation had become one of the largest private naval preservation organizations in the United States, respected by historians and naval enthusiasts and even grudgingly acknowledged by the Navy itself as doing important work preserving military history. The submarine had become available through channels Thomas had cultivated over decades of dealing with military surplus, a contact at the Naval Sea Systems Command, who called him personally in January 2024 to say that USS Montana, a Virginia-class attack submarine commissioned in 2012 and mysteriously decommissioned in 2023 after only 11 years of service, was being offered for sale to qualified buyers who could demonstrate both financial capacity and proper security protocols for handling a vessel that had once been one of the most advanced submarines in the American fleet. The asking price was $600,000, which seemed absurdly cheap for a submarine that had cost over $2.8 billion to build. But Thomas understood the economics of decommissioned naval vessels. The cost of properly maintaining and displaying a submarine was astronomical. The number of potential buyers was vanishingly small, and the Navy wanted these vessels in museums where they could be controlled and monitored, rather than sitting in salvage yards where enterprising foreign intelligence agencies might try to examine them for technological secrets. $600,000 was enough to ensure only serious buyers with legitimate purposes would bid, while still being low enough that museums and educational foundations could potentially afford it. Thomas submitted his bid along with detailed plans for how the submarine would be displayed at his flagship facility in Norfolk, Virginia, security protocols for preventing unauthorized access to potentially sensitive areas, and financial documentation proving the Maritime Heritage Foundation had both the capital to purchase the vessel and the ongoing revenue to maintain it properly. 3 other museums bid, but Thomas's reputation and established track record made him the Navy's preferred buyer, and in March 2024, he signed papers that made him the civilian owner of a nuclear attack submarine that until very recently had been prowling the depths conducting missions that would remain classified for decades. The submarine arrived in Norfolk on a massive transport barge in early April, a process that required careful coordination with the Coast Guard and local authorities because moving a 377-foot submarine through commercial shipping channels created challenges that few people had experience managing. Thomas watched from the dock as the Montana was maneuvered into position at his museum's submarine pier, the black hull still bearing the scars and markings of active service, the sail rising like a dark fin above the main body, the whole massive structure somehow both graceful and menacing even in retirement. The Navy's decommissioning team had spent months preparing the Montana for civilian ownership, removing the nuclear reactor and replacing it with ballast, stripping out weapon systems and classified sonar equipment, welding shut certain compartments that contained technology still considered sensitive, and generally ensuring that what Thomas was buying was a submarine-shaped museum exhibit rather than a functional military vessel. He'd received thick binders of documentation detailing exactly what had been removed and what had been left in place, blueprints showing the submarine's layout with color coding, indicating which areas were accessible and which had been permanently sealed, and certifications from multiple Navy departments confirming that USS Montana no longer posed any security risk and was approved for public display. Thomas spent the first 2 weeks after the submarine's arrival simply organizing the logistics of opening it to visitors, installing proper lighting and ventilation systems since the submarine would no longer have its own power generation, creating safe walkways and viewing areas that would allow tourists to experience the vessel without damaging historically significant equipment, and training his museum staff on the submarine's history and technical specifications so they could lead informed tours. The Montana was scheduled to open to the public in June, giving Thomas about 6 weeks to complete the preparation work and generate the kind of media attention that would draw visitors and justify the enormous investment he'd made. It was during a structural survey in late April, 3 weeks after the submarine had arrived, that Thomas first noticed something wrong with the blueprints he'd been given. He was in the torpedo room with his chief engineer, a former Navy submarine officer named Robert Chen, who'd retired after 25 years of service and now worked for the Maritime Heritage Foundation, ensuring their vessels were properly maintained and safely accessible to the public. They were checking hull integrity and measuring compartment dimensions to ensure the tourist walkways they'd designed would actually fit in the available space. "The measurements don't match," Robert said, consulting his tablet where the official blueprints were displayed while holding a laser measuring device that showed the actual distance between bulkheads. "According to these plans, this compartment should be 42 feet long, but I'm only getting 38 feet. That's a 4-foot discrepancy." Thomas took the measuring device and confirmed the readings himself, then looked at the blueprint more carefully. Could the plans be wrong? Old measurements that didn't account for modifications made during the submarine's service life? "Not likely for a vessel this new," Robert replied. "The Virginia class has extremely precise documentation because everything about these submarines was computer designed and manufactured to exact specifications. A 4-foot error in the blueprints would be caught immediately during construction." He walked to the aft bulkhead of the torpedo room and knocked on the steel, listening to the sound with the practiced ear of someone who'd spent decades working with submarine hulls. "This sounds wrong too. Too hollow. Like there's empty space behind it." They spent the next hour examining the bulkhead carefully, finding what appeared to be a seamless section of hull, but which closer inspection revealed had slightly different welding patterns than the surrounding structure, as if this section had been installed separately or modified after the submarine's initial construction. Robert ran his hands along the seams, feeling for irregularities that weren't visible to the eye, until his fingers caught on something that felt like a recessed button or pressure point hidden in the welding. "Don't touch that," Thomas warned, but Robert had already pressed it, and the sound of mechanical locks disengaging echoed through the compartment with a series of metallic clicks that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. A section of the bulkhead that had appeared solid began moving, sliding sideways on rails that must have been concealed within the hull structure, revealing a dark opening into a space that absolutely should not exist according to every blueprint and schematic Thomas had been given. Robert pulled out a flashlight and pointed it into the opening, the beam revealing a compartment approximately 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, lined with equipment that didn't match anything Thomas had seen during his years of working with naval vessels. Electronics that looked modern and active, display screens that were powered down but showed standby indicators, and a small workstation with a chair that had been recently used based on the way its cushion was compressed and the lack of dust that covered everything else in the sealed submarine. "This isn't on any of the blueprints," Robert said unnecessarily, his voice carrying an edge of concern that Thomas immediately understood. "This compartment was deliberately hidden, which means whatever happens in here was never meant to be discovered by whoever bought this submarine." Thomas stepped closer to the opening, his mind racing through implications and possibilities, trying to understand how a hidden compartment could exist in a submarine that had supposedly been thoroughly inspected and cleared by the Navy before being sold. The equipment inside looked sophisticated and well-maintained, not mothballed or deactivated like everything else on the vessel, and several of the display screens showed status indicators suggesting they were receiving power from somewhere, despite the fact that the submarine's reactor had been removed and no other power source should be available. "We need to report this," Robert said, already pulling out his phone. "Call the Navy, tell them there's been a mistake. Let them come retrieve whatever classified equipment got left behind by accident." But Thomas was looking at something on the workstation that made his blood run cold. A small framed photograph sitting next to the computer terminal, showing a man in a Navy officer's uniform with captain's insignia, and a smile that Thomas would have recognized anywhere because he'd spent 28 years trying to forget that face and failing every single time. The photograph showed his father, Captain James Graves, who had disappeared during a classified submarine mission in 1996 and been officially declared lost at sea with all hands when his submarine, USS Alexandria, had experienced a catastrophic failure that sent it to the bottom of the Atlantic with no survivors and no recovered bodies. Thomas picked up the photograph with hands that shook slightly, turning it over to find writing on the back in handwriting he'd last seen on birthday cards when he was 24 years old, before his father had shipped out on the mission that would be his last. The message was dated 3 months ago, January 2024, which was impossible because James Graves had been dead for 28 years. The note read, "If you're reading this, you found the room. I'm sorry I've been gone so long. I'm sorry for everything you've been told, but I'm not dead, and I need you to find me before they realize you've discovered what we've been doing down here. Dad." Robert was staring at the photograph over Thomas's shoulder, his expression confused and concerned. "Thomas, what is that? Who's the officer in the picture?" "My father," Thomas heard himself say, his voice sounding distant and strange. "The father who's been dead since I was 24 years old. The father who apparently isn't dead at all, and has been using this submarine for something classified enough that the Navy hid an entire compartment from their own decommissioning process." "That's impossible," Robert said. "USS Montana was commissioned in 2012. Your father disappeared in 1996. There's no way his photograph would be in a submarine that didn't exist when he supposedly died." But Thomas was looking at other items in the compartment now, documents in waterproof folders, technical manuals for equipment he didn't recognize, and a logbook with entries dating back to 2013, just 1 year after the Montana had been commissioned. The entries were in multiple hands, different officers recording activities in deliberately vague language that suggested they knew the logs might someday be discovered, and were careful not to include information that would immediately compromise whatever operation they were documenting. The most recent entry was dated February 2024, just 2 months ago, weeks after Thomas had won the bid for the submarine, but before it had been delivered to his museum. The entry read, "Final mission complete. Compartment to be sealed permanently. All personnel reassigned to other vessels. Project Deep Sanctuary concludes after 31 years of continuous operation. May God forgive us for the secrets we've kept and the lies we've told. Commander Patricia Walsh, Final Officer in Charge." Thomas photographed the entry with his phone, his hand steadier now as shock began giving way to determination and the realization that he'd stumbled onto something that might finally explain what had really happened to his father 28 years ago. Deep Sanctuary, whatever it was, had been operating since 1993, which meant it had begun 3 years before his father's supposed death, and had continued for decades afterward, running parallel to official submarine operations, and hidden from everyone except the personnel directly involved. "We're not calling the Navy," Thomas decided. "Not yet. First I need to understand what this compartment was used for, and what Deep Sanctuary means and how my father's photograph ended up in a submarine that shouldn't have any connection to him. Thomas, that's classified equipment in a classified space that we just accessed without authorization. If we don't report this immediately, we could be charged with espionage or violations of national security law. And if we report it immediately, whoever's been running Deep Sanctuary will seal this room, confiscate everything in it, classify the entire incident so thoroughly that I'll never get answers about what happened to my dad, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if he's actually dead or if he's out there somewhere doing whatever Deep Sanctuary personnel do." Thomas looked at his engineer. "Robert, you served on submarines for 25 years. Have you ever heard of Deep Sanctuary?" "Never, which is either because it's so classified that submarine officers at my level weren't briefed on it, or because it's something unofficial that exists outside normal Navy command structure. Then we have 48 hours to figure out which possibility is true before I decide whether to report this, or whether to follow the instructions in my father's note and try to find him." Thomas began photographing everything in the compartment, the equipment, the documents, the logbook entries, creating a record that would survive even if the Navy confiscated the originals. If Deep Sanctuary is official, reporting it costs me nothing except answers. If it's unofficial, reporting it might get my father killed if he's actually alive. or might help cover up whatever happened to the officers who supposedly died with him in 1996. Robert watched him work, clearly torn between his sense of duty as a former naval officer and his loyalty to Thomas, who'd been his employer and friend for 8 years. Finally, he sighed and pulled out his own phone to help document the compartment. 48 hours, he agreed. Then we call someone, even if it's just a congressman or journalist who can investigate without immediately alerting whoever's been running this program. But Thomas, if your father really has been alive all these years, you need to be prepared for the possibility that he chose not to contact you, that he's been living a completely different life and might not want to be found. Thomas continued photographing, his mind already moving past that possibility to the only question that actually mattered. If his father had been alive for 28 years and hadn't contacted his family, there had to be a reason important enough to justify that abandonment, and whatever that reason was, it was connected to the hidden compartment in a submarine that the Navy had sold to civilian ownership, while apparently forgetting or deliberately choosing not to remember that classified. Equipment and secret programs don't simply disappear just because the vessel carrying them has been officially retired. The sound of footsteps on the deck above them made both men freeze, heavy boots moving with purpose toward the hatch that led down to the torpedo room, and Thomas realized with a sinking feeling that 48 hours might have been an optimistic estimate, because whoever had been monitoring this compartment remotely had probably received an alert the moment the hidden door had been opened, and they were about to have visitors who would have very strong opinions about what Thomas had discovered and what happened to people who stumbled onto secrets that were supposed to stay hidden forever. Thomas shoved his phone into his pocket and stepped away from the hidden compartment, his mind racing through options that all seemed to end badly, while Robert moved toward the torpedo room's main hatch with the kind of alert readiness that came from decades of military training. The footsteps above grew louder, multiple people descending the ladder into the submarine with practiced efficiency, and Thomas found himself thinking about his father's photograph and the impossible message written on the back, instructions from a dead man telling him to find answers before someone stopped him from looking. The first person through the hatch was a woman in her late 40s wearing civilian clothes that somehow looked military, despite the absence of uniform, khaki pants and a dark jacket that probably concealed a weapon, her movements economical, and her eyes scanning the compartment with the thoroughness of someone trained to assess threats quickly. Behind her came 2 men in their 30s, similarly dressed, similarly alert, and carrying themselves with the posture of people who'd spent time in special operations or intelligence work. "Mr. Graves," the woman said, her voice carrying authority that didn't need volume to be effective. "My name is Commander Patricia Walsh. I believe you found something that doesn't belong to you." Thomas recognized the name immediately from the logbook entry he'd photographed minutes ago. The final officer in charge of Deep Sanctuary, who'd written about the program concluding after 31 years. "You're 3 weeks late," he said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "The submarine was delivered to my museum almost a month ago. If you wanted to retrieve classified equipment, you should have done it before the Navy sold me the vessel." Walsh's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been surprise or might have been reassessment of the situation. "The equipment in that compartment was supposed to have been removed during decommissioning," she said. "The fact that it wasn't represents a serious security failure that we're here to correct." Robert stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Thomas and the visitors in a gesture that was subtle but clear. "Commander Walsh, I served on submarines for 25 years, and I've never heard of any protocol that allows hidden compartments to remain operational on vessels being transferred to civilian ownership. Either someone made a catastrophic mistake, or this equipment was deliberately left in place for reasons you're not telling us." Walsh studied Robert for a moment, her gaze measuring and calculating. Lieutenant Commander Robert Chen, retired 2021 after 25 years of service, most recently assigned to USS Jimmy Carter. She rattled off his service history with the ease of someone who'd memorized his file before arriving. "You have a top-secret clearance that's technically still active for another 2 years under your retirement agreement. The men you're protecting don't have any clearance, which means this conversation is going to be very one-sided, unless you'd like to step outside and let us handle this professionally." Thomas felt anger cutting through his uncertainty and fear. "My father was Captain James Graves, USS Alexandria, lost at sea in 1996 with all hands. Except I just found his photograph in that compartment, dated 3 months ago, with a note telling me to find him. So before you start talking about clearances and protocols, you're going to explain how a dead man's picture ended up on a submarine that didn't exist when he supposedly died. The reaction from Walsh was immediate and impossible to hide, a flash of genuine shock crossing her face before professional control reasserted itself. She glanced at one of the men behind her, some silent communication passing between them, and Thomas knew with absolute certainty that he'd just revealed information they hadn't expected him to possess. "You found the photograph," Walsh said quietly, and it wasn't a question. "Along with logbooks and documents and equipment that's still powered on despite this submarine having no reactor and no external power source," Thomas confirmed. "So either you explain what Deep Sanctuary is and what happened to my father, or I contact every journalist and congressman I know and turn this into a public scandal that ends careers and destroys whatever secrecy you've been maintaining for 3 decades. Walsh stood very still for a moment, clearly weighing options and calculating risks, and Thomas could see the exact instant she made a decision that changed her approach from threatening to negotiating. "Mr. Graves, what I'm about to tell you is classified at a level that requires special compartmented clearance that you don't possess. By law, I cannot discuss Deep Sanctuary with unauthorized personnel, but I can tell you that your father didn't die in 1996, and if you're willing to accept temporary clearance under emergency provisions, I can explain why he disappeared and where he is now." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, confirmation that 28 years of grief and loss and unanswered questions had been built on a lie. "He's alive," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, he's been alive." "The answer is complicated," Walsh replied. "But yes, Captain James Graves is alive, and he's the reason you bought this submarine, though you didn't know it at the time." She gestured toward the hidden compartment. "That equipment wasn't left here by accident, Mr. Graves. It was left here deliberately, as part of a plan your father developed to ensure certain information would eventually reach you without compromising active operations or putting you at risk before the timing was right." "What kind of information?" Thomas demanded. "Information about a submarine program that's been operating continuously since 1993, conducting missions that officially don't exist and can never be acknowledged, crewed by officers who are legally dead and technically don't exist in any military database." Walsh moved closer to the compartment opening. "Deep Sanctuary is how the United States maintains plausible deniability while conducting submarine operations in territorial waters, where we have no legal authorization to operate. Every officer involved volunteered to disappear, to let their families believe they died, so they could continue serving in ways that conventional military operations couldn't accomplish." Thomas felt sick, understanding beginning to dawn about what his father had chosen and what that choice had cost everyone who loved him. "He volunteered to fake his death? To let my mother and me and my sister believe he was gone?" "He volunteered to prevent a war," Walsh corrected. "In 1996, intelligence indicated that a rogue nuclear submarine from a foreign power was operating in the Atlantic, preparing to launch a strike that would have killed millions of people. The Alexandria was the only submarine close enough to intercept, but intercepting meant operating in territorial waters without authorization and engaging in combat that would have created an international incident if it became public. Your father and his crew chose to intercept anyway, to prevent the attack, and to accept being declared dead so the engagement could be classified and denied forever. And the other officers on the Alexandria? The 73 men who supposedly died with him? All alive, all reassigned to Deep Sanctuary operations over the past 28 years, all maintaining their cover as deceased so they can continue missions that keep people safe, without creating political complications that would prevent necessary actions." Walsh pulled out a tablet and brought up files that showed photographs of men in submarine settings, and Thomas recognized several faces from memorial services he'd attended, officers his family had mourned who were apparently living secret lives. The program recruits from regular submarine crews, identifying officers who are willing to make the sacrifice and who have the psychological profile to handle the isolation and secrecy. Your father has served on 7 different submarines since 1996, each one conducting missions that will never appear in official records. Robert had been listening to all of this with an expression that mixed horror and understanding. How many submarines are part of Deep Sanctuary? How many supposedly decommissioned vessels are actually still operating with ghost crews? That's classified, Walsh replied. But I can tell you that USS Montana was one of our newest vessels, And it really has been decommissioned, which is why the compartment was left in place. The equipment you found was meant to be discovered, Mr. Graves, because your father wants out. After 28 years, he wants to come home, and the only way to do that without being prosecuted for desertion is to expose Deep Sanctuary in a way that forces the program to be officially acknowledged and its personnel to be properly retired. So I'm the exposure mechanism, Thomas said. He arranged for me to buy this submarine knowing I'd find the hidden compartment and the photograph and the logbooks that prove Deep Sanctuary exists. Exactly, Walsh confirmed. Though I should tell you that not everyone in the program agrees with your father's decision. There are officers who believe Deep Sanctuary is too important to be exposed, who think maintaining the secrecy is worth the personal sacrifice, and who will fight to keep this quiet even if it means silencing everyone who knows about it. Thomas felt cold despite the humid warmth of the submarine's interior. Are you one of those officers? I was, Walsh admitted. For 28 years I believed the mission justified everything we sacrificed. But I also watched good people destroy themselves trying to maintain cover lives they could never fully commit to, watched marriages fall apart in absentia, and children grow up without parents who were technically alive but functionally gone forever. She looked directly at Thomas. Your father was right to want out. You all deserve the truth, and the program needs to end before more families are destroyed by secrets that stop being heroic and just become cruel. One of the men behind Walsh shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving slightly toward his jacket, and Thomas noticed Robert tensing in response, the two former military officers reading threat signals that civilians might have missed. Commander, the man said, his voice tight with warning. We need to report this situation to higher authority before making any decisions about disclosure. We report this and you know exactly what happens, Walsh shot back, her authority over the junior officer clear despite all of them technically being civilians now. The program gets buried deeper, everyone involved gets reassigned to other cover operations, and Mr. Graves gets visited by people who are much less friendly than we are, and who have authorization to ensure his cooperation through whatever means necessary. The second man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a southern accent and a tone of someone genuinely troubled by competing obligations. Ma'am, with respect, we all took oaths to protect classified operations. Exposing Deep Sanctuary puts active missions at risk, compromises intelligence gathering that's currently keeping the country safe, and violates every security protocol we spent our careers upholding. Those oaths didn't include lying to families for 30 years, Walsh replied. Didn't include operating completely outside congressional oversight and legal authorization. Didn't include creating a shadow submarine fleet that answers to no one and conducts operations that the American people would never approve if they knew they were happening. Thomas listened to them argue, understanding that he was watching a conflict that had probably been building within Deep Sanctuary for years. Officers torn between duty to the mission and recognition that what they were doing had crossed lines that couldn't be justified indefinitely. Where is my father now? He interrupted. If he wants out, if he's the one who arranged for me to find this, where can I find him? Walsh pulled up something on her tablet and turned it so Thomas could see a map showing coordinates in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 300 miles east of Virginia. He's currently serving on USS Seawolf, which officially was decommissioned in 2022, but actually continues operating as a Deep Sanctuary vessel. The submarine surfaces twice a month to exchange personnel and receive supplies from a support vessel that's disguised as a commercial fishing operation. The next surface window is in 6 days, and your father will be aboard. How do I get there? Thomas asked. How do I reach a submarine that's not supposed to exist? You don't, the first man said flatly. Civilians don't get access to Deep Sanctuary vessels. Even us, we're technically not supposed to know specific locations or operational details anymore. We're retired, remember? But Walsh was looking at Thomas with an expression that suggested she'd already considered this scenario and had decided on a course of action. There's a support vessel departing from a private dock in Hampton in 4 days, she said, bringing up more information on her tablet. It's registered as a commercial fishing boat, but it's actually run by Deep Sanctuary logistics personnel. If you were to stow away, or if someone were to arrange for you to be brought aboard without official authorization, you could potentially reach the Seawolf during the personnel exchange. That's insane, the Southern officer protested. You're talking about helping a civilian access classified operations. That's treason, Commander. I'm talking about helping a son find his father, Walsh corrected. And I'm talking about giving deep sanctuary personnel who want out a path to come home without being prosecuted or disappeared. She looked at Thomas. If you do this, if you reach that submarine and convince your father and others to come forward publicly, the program can't continue. Too much exposure, too many questions, too much political pressure. Deep Sanctuary will be forced to officially acknowledge its existence and retire its personnel properly. And if I fail? Thomas asked. If I reach the submarine and my father changes his mind, or if someone stops me before I get there, then you'll have attempted to access classified military operations without authorization, which is a federal crime that carries a 20-year prison sentence, and Deep Sanctuary will continue operating with new security measures that ensure this kind of breach never happens again. Walsh closed her tablet. It's your choice, Mr. Graves. Walk away now. Pretend you never found that compartment, live the rest of your life knowing your father's alive somewhere but accepting you'll never see him again. Or risk everything to bring him home and expose a program that probably needs to be exposed, but will fight desperately to remain hidden. Thomas thought about 28 years of grief, about his mother dying 5 years ago, still believing her husband had drowned, about his sister who'd struggled with abandonment issues her entire adult life because their father had disappeared when she was 16, about all the families of the 73 other Alexandria crew members who'd been mourning men who were actually alive and serving in secret. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Tell me about the fishing boat, Thomas said. Tell me how to get aboard and what I need to know to reach that submarine without getting arrested or killed before I can talk to my father. Walsh smiled, small and sad and somehow resigned, as if she'd known from the moment she'd entered the submarine that this was how the conversation would end. The boat is called the Northern Star, and it's going to be the most dangerous fishing trip you've ever taken. Thomas spent the next 4 days preparing for a journey that felt simultaneously like the most important thing he'd ever done and the most reckless decision of his life. Gathering supplies that Walsh had specified through encrypted messages that arrived on his phone from numbers that disappeared minutes after he read them. Learning basic submarine terminology and protocols from Robert, who'd agreed to help despite serious reservations about the entire plan, and trying very hard not to think about all the ways this could end with him in federal prison or at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The Maritime Heritage Foundation continued operating normally, his staff having no idea that their director was about to attempt accessing classified military operations, and Thomas went through the motions of museum administration, while his mind was entirely focused on the reality that his father was alive and serving on a submarine that officially didn't exist. Walsh had provided detailed instructions through those disappearing messages, explaining that the Northern Star departed from a private dock in Hampton at 0400 hours, that the crew consisted of 6 Deep Sanctuary support personnel who rotated assignments between vessels and shore facilities, and that Thomas would need to board before 0330 to have any chance of remaining undetected during the security sweep that preceded departure. She'd also warned him that once aboard, he'd have approximately 72 hours before the vessel reached the rendezvous coordinates with USS Seawolf, and during that time, he'd need to stay hidden in cargo areas while avoiding the crew who would immediately report his presence if they discovered him before the submarine exchange. Robert drove him to Hampton on the night of departure, the two of them sitting in the truck outside the private marina where the Northern Star was docked, watching the pre-dawn darkness for signs of crew activity. "This is insane," Robert said for probably the 20th time since they'd left Norfolk. "You're about to stow away on a vessel conducting classified operations, sail 300 miles into the Atlantic, and somehow convince submarine officers to expose a program that's been successfully hidden for 30 years. The odds of success are essentially zero." "Then I'll fail spectacularly," Thomas replied, checking the waterproof bag that held his phone, documents he'd photographed from the hidden compartment, and supplies for 3 days of hiding in what Walsh had described as extremely uncomfortable cargo spaces. "But at least I'll fail trying to get answers instead of spending the rest of my life wondering what really happened to my dad." Movement near the Northern Star caught their attention. 3 figures walking down the dock carrying equipment bags, their conversation too distant to hear but their body language suggesting the casual efficiency of people performing a routine they'd executed dozens of times. The fishing boat looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a 48-foot commercial vessel with nets and tackle, and all the external markers of a legitimate operation. But Thomas could see subtle differences that marked it as something more. Communications equipment that seemed more sophisticated than fishing boats typically carried, and what looked like concealed access panels that probably hid storage for items that weren't related to catching fish. "That's your window," Robert said. "They're loading gear, which means they're not watching the dock approaches. You've got maybe 10 minutes before they finish and start their departure checklist." Thomas grabbed his bag and opened the truck door, pausing to look at Robert one more time. "If I don't come back, if something goes wrong and I end up arrested or worse, make sure the photographs I took get to journalists who'll use them. Don't let Deep Sanctuary bury this completely." "You're coming back," Robert said firmly. "With your father and with enough evidence to force this program into the light. Anything else is unacceptable." Thomas moved quickly across the marina parking lot, staying in shadows and using parked vehicles for cover, approaching the Northern Star from the stern, where the crew's activity was focused toward the bow. The boat sat low in the water, its deck about 4 feet above the dock level, and Walsh had told him that the cargo hold access was through a hatch near the stern that was typically left unsealed until just before departure. He reached the vessel undetected and found the hatch exactly where she described it, a metal cover that lifted with minimal noise to reveal a ladder descending into darkness that smelled like diesel fuel and old fish and the ocean itself. He climbed down and pulled the hatch closed above him, plunging himself into complete darkness while his heart hammered so hard he was certain anyone nearby would hear it. His hands found the waterproof bag and extracted a small flashlight, its red lens providing just enough illumination to show a cramped space filled with supplies, spare equipment, and containers marked with innocuous labels that probably concealed less innocent contents. Walsh had told him to position himself behind a row of large storage containers in the aft corner, a space that would be uncomfortable but unlikely to be accessed during the voyage, unless something went wrong with the boat's systems. The next 2 hours were the longest of Thomas's life, sitting in darkness listening to the sounds of the crew completing their departure preparations, engines starting and lines being cast off, and the subtle change in motion as the Northern Star left the dock and headed toward open water. He could hear voices occasionally, crew members moving through the spaces above him, conversations that were casual and professional, and gave no indication that these people were anything other than commercial fishermen heading out for a routine trip. But Thomas knew better now, understood that deception at this level required total commitment to the cover story, and that these 6 people were probably military veterans who'd learned to inhabit their civilian roles so completely that no observer would suspect the truth. By the time the sun rose and the Northern Star was far enough from shore that radio communications became encrypted and more frequent, Thomas had been hiding in the cargo hold for 6 hours, his body cramped and uncomfortable, but his mind sharp with anticipation and planning for what would happen when they reached the submarine. Walsh had explained that personnel exchanges happened quickly, 20 minutes maximum while the Seawolf remained on the surface and vulnerable to detection, and Thomas would need to move from the fishing boat to the submarine during that window without being stopped by either crew, both of whom would have orders to prevent unauthorized boarding. The first day passed slowly, Thomas rationing the food and water he'd brought while listening to the rhythm of the boat and trying to identify patterns in crew movement that might give him advantages when the time came to reveal himself. He dozed fitfully, waking at every sound that seemed closer than usual, and used his phone to review the photographs he'd taken from the hidden compartment, studying his father's handwriting and trying to imagine what James Graves looked like after 28 years of living a secret life. On the second day, Thomas heard something that made his blood run cold. 2 crew members talking directly above his hiding spot, their voices clear enough that he could make out individual words even through the deck. Did Walsh really send a message saying we might have a stowaway? The first voice asked, young and uncertain. That doesn't make sense. How would anyone know about our departure schedule? Commander's been acting strange since the Montana situation, the second voice replied, older and more cautious. Heard she had contact with the civilian who bought the submarine, the one who found the sealed compartment. Maybe she's testing us, seeing if we're alert to security breaches. Or maybe she's helping someone reach the Seawolf, which means we need to decide whose orders we're following if we actually find a stowaway. Walsh's orders or the program's orders. The conversation moved away as the crew members continued their rounds. But Thomas understood that his presence had been anticipated or suspected, and that Walsh's warning about not everyone in Deep Sanctuary supporting exposure had been more accurate than he'd wanted to believe. Some of the crew might help him reach the submarine as Walsh had suggested, but others might see him as a security threat that needed to be neutralized before he could compromise active operations. On the third day, Approximately 62 hours after leaving Hampton, the Northern Star's engines changed pitch, and the vessel began moving in a pattern that suggested it was searching for something or approaching coordinates with extreme precision. Thomas heard increased activity above, crew members calling out instructions and preparing equipment, and he knew without being told that they were approaching the rendezvous point where USS Seawolf would surface for the personnel exchange. He gathered his belongings and prepared to move, knowing that the next 20 minutes would determine whether he reached his father or whether this entire desperate plan ended in failure and consequences he could barely imagine. The cargo hold hatch opened suddenly, flooding the space with daylight that made Thomas squint after 3 days in near darkness, and a figure descended the ladder with the quick efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The figure was Walsh, somehow aboard the Northern Star despite Thomas having no idea she'd been part of the crew, her expression grim but determined as she moved toward his hiding place. "Time to move, Mr. Graves," she said quietly. "The Seawolf is surfacing in 8 minutes and we have a very narrow window to get you aboard before the crew on both vessels realizes what's happening. There are 3 men on this boat who'll try to stop you if they know you're here, and at least a dozen submarine officers who'll have orders to prevent unauthorized boarding. Your father is expecting you because I sent him a coded message yesterday, but getting to him means moving faster and smarter than you probably thought possible." Thomas emerged from behind the storage containers, his legs stiff from 3 days of confinement, his mind sharp with adrenaline that was cutting through exhaustion and fear. Where is he? Where on the submarine will my father be? He'll be in the sail, topside during the exchange because he's senior enough that his presence won't be questioned and isolated enough that you can reach him without immediately encountering other crew. Walsh led him to the ladder. "But Mr. Graves, you need to understand something before we do this. If you reach your father and he confirms everything I've told you, if he agrees to expose Deep Sanctuary and bring other officers home, there are people who will see that as treason rather than whistleblowing. People who have authorization to prevent exposure by any means necessary. Getting to the submarine is dangerous, but what happens after might be even worse." "I've spent 28 years believing my father was dead," Thomas said, climbing the ladder toward daylight and open ocean, and the impossible reunion that had driven every decision since finding that photograph. "Whatever happens next, at least I'll know the truth, and whatever the cost of that truth, it's better than the cost of continuing to live with lies." He reached the deck and saw it immediately. Approximately 200 yards away and still rising from the depths, the distinctive black hull of a Virginia-class submarine breaking the surface with water streaming from its sail, the American flag visible on the mast in a detail that seemed almost mockingly normal for a vessel that officially didn't exist, and was crewed by men who were legally dead. The submarine looked exactly like the Montana sitting in his Norfolk museum, same class and configuration, but this one was alive and operational, and contained answers that Thomas had been seeking for longer than some of the junior officers aboard had been alive. The Northern Star was already moving closer, approaching the submarine's port side for the transfer, and Thomas could see figures emerging from the sail hatch, submarine officers in working uniforms preparing to receive personnel and supplies during the brief window when the Seawolf would be vulnerable on the surface. Walsh handed him a life vest and pointed toward a boarding ladder that was being lowered from the fishing boat's side. "Your father is the officer on the left, second from the sail hatch," she said. "You've got approximately 90 seconds from when you start climbing that ladder to reach him before someone realizes you're not authorized personnel and sounds an alarm. Once that alarm sounds, this becomes a security incident that neither I nor your father can control, and we'll all be dealing with consequences that can't be predicted or prevented." She met his eyes. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" Thomas looked at the distant figure Walsh had indicated, a man in submarine officer's uniform whose face he couldn't see clearly from this distance, but whose posture and bearing carried something familiar, something that resonated with memories 28 years old and felt simultaneously like yesterday and like another lifetime entirely. He thought about his mother dying without knowing the truth, about his sister's abandonment issues, about all the other families mourning men who weren't actually dead, and about the choice his father had made to volunteer for a program that had stolen 28 years from everyone who loved him. "I'm certain," Thomas said, and climbed over the Northern Star's rail toward the ladder that would carry him across 200 yards of Atlantic Ocean and 28 years of lies to a reunion that would either expose one of the most classified programs in American military history or destroy everyone involved in trying to bring it to light. The water below was dark and deep and looked cold enough to kill quickly if he fell, But Thomas didn't hesitate, didn't look back, just climbed down toward the small motorized raft that would carry him to the submarine, and to his father, and to whatever truth lay waiting on a vessel that the Navy claimed didn't exist, but which was currently sitting on the surface of the ocean, carrying crew members who were supposed to be ghosts. The motorized raft cut through the water between the Northern Star and the submarine with Walsh at the controls, her movements practiced and efficient, while Thomas crouched in the bow watching the Seawolf grow larger with each passing second, close enough now that he could see individual faces of the officers on deck, their expressions alert and professional as they prepared to receive what they thought would be routine personnel transfer. The officer Walsh had identified as his father stood near the sail hatch, his face still partially obscured by distance and the angle of morning sun reflecting off the water, but something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders and the slight tilt of his head when listening to another officer speak, triggered memories so powerful that Thomas felt 28 years collapsing into nothing. 60 seconds, Walsh said quietly, her voice barely audible over the raft's small motor. Once you're on that deck, move directly to your father and stay close to him. Don't run, don't draw attention, just walk like you belong there until someone realizes you don't. Your father knows you're coming, but most of the crew doesn't, and their training will be to intercept and detain any unauthorized personnel immediately. The submarine loomed above them now, its black hull wet and glistening, the sail rising like a tower with the American flag snapping in the ocean wind, and Thomas could see the officer clearly now, could see his face after 28 years, older and weathered and carrying lines that hadn't been there when Thomas was 24, but unmistakably, undeniably, the father he'd believed was dead. James Graves stood perfectly still for a moment when he saw Thomas in the approaching raft, his expression cycling through shock and recognition, and something that looked like grief, or maybe joy, or possibly both, and then his professional mask slammed back into place as he turned to say something to the officer beside him. Walsh brought the raft alongside the submarine's hull where a ladder extended down to water level, and Thomas grabbed the cold metal rungs without hesitation, climbing upward while his heart hammered so hard it felt like it might break through his chest. He reached the deck and stepped onto the non-slip surface that was still wet from the submarine's recent surfacing, and suddenly he was standing 5 feet from his father, close enough to see gray and hair that had been dark, close enough to see recognition and fear and desperate hope in eyes that looked exactly as Thomas remembered them, from birthday mornings and fishing trips, and the last time he'd seen his father alive before the Alexandria had deployed on what was supposed to be a 3-month mission. "Thomas," James Graves said, his voice rougher than Thomas remembered but carrying the same tone, the same rhythm of speech that had been reading bedtime stories and explaining how submarines worked and saying goodbye at the dock in 1996. "You shouldn't be here. This is incredibly dangerous for both of us." "You've been dead for 28 years, Thomas replied, staying motionless even though every instinct screamed to close the distance and embrace his father and confirm that this was real, and not some elaborate hallucination born from 3 days hiding in darkness and too much hope invested in a photograph. "You don't get to tell me what's dangerous anymore." Another officer moved closer, a commander in his 40s with the alert expression of someone whose job was security, and who'd just recognized that something about this personnel transfer wasn't following standard protocol. "Captain, this man isn't on the authorized roster." "Who authorized his boarding?" "I did," James said, his voice carrying command authority that came from decades of submarine service. "Commander Morrison, this is my son Thomas. He's here under emergency provisions that I'll explain to Commander Walsh and the program directors once we're below deck. For now, treat him as authorized personnel, and let's complete this transfer quickly before we attract attention from satellites or maritime traffic." Morrison didn't look convinced, his hand moving to the radio clipped to his belt. But before he could speak into it, Walsh climbed onto the deck from the raft and positioned herself between Morrison and the communication equipment. "The transfer is authorized, Commander," she said with calm certainty. "Captain Graves invoked family emergency protocols, and I approved the exception under my authority as Program Oversight Coordinator. If you have concerns, you can file them through proper channels after we're submerged and secure. Family emergency protocols don't exist in deep sanctuary regulations," Morrison countered, but his uncertainty was visible now, caught between conflicting orders from superior officers and procedures that were deliberately vague to maintain operational flexibility. James moved quickly, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder and guiding him toward the sail hatch. "We're going below," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Morrison, complete the supply transfer and get us submerged in the next 5 minutes. Walsh, you're with us. Anyone else who has concerns can bring them to me once we're at depth, and I've had a chance to speak with my son privately." They descended through the sail hatch into the submarine's interior, Thomas's legs moving automatically down the ladder while his mind struggled to process that he was actually here, actually on a classified submarine with his supposedly dead father, actually about to get answers to questions that had defined his entire adult life. The submarine's interior smelled like every submarine Thomas had ever toured, recycled air and hydraulic fluid and the unique metallic scent of pressure hulls designed to operate at depths that would crush conventional vessels. But this one felt different because it was operational and active, and the people moving through its corridors were performing real missions, rather than giving tours to museum visitors. James led them to a small office that Thomas recognized as the captain's cabin, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, but providing the only private space on a vessel where 130 crew members lived in impossibly close quarters. Walsh followed them inside and closed the door, standing with her back against it in a posture that suggested she was both guarding their privacy and blocking potential interruptions. 28 years, Thomas said, his voice shaking with emotions he couldn't fully identify or control. 28 years we thought you were dead. Mom died 5 years ago, still believing you'd drowned. Sarah struggled with abandonment issues her entire adult life because her father disappeared. And you've been here the whole time, alive and serving on submarines while we mourned you. James sat heavily in his desk chair, suddenly looking older than his 68 years, the weight of decades of secrecy visible in every line of his face. "I know what I did to you. I know what I did to your mother and Sarah and everyone who loved me. I've lived with that guilt every single day for 28 years, and there's nothing I can say that will make it right or justify what I chose." "Then try explaining it," Thomas demanded. "Explain how preventing one attack in 1996 was worth destroying your entire family for 3 decades. "It wasn't one attack," James said quietly. "It was one attack that month, and then another 3 months later, and another 6 months after that. Deep Sanctuary didn't end with the Alexandria's mission in 96. It became permanent because the threats didn't stop, and someone needed to respond to them in ways that official channels couldn't authorize or acknowledge. "So you volunteered to stay dead and keep serving," Thomas said. "You chose submarines over your family. I chose to prevent nuclear weapons from being used against American cities," James corrected, his voice carrying an edge of defensive anger that suggested this was an argument he'd had with himself countless times. "I chose to stop terrorists and rogue actors who were operating in ways that diplomacy and conventional military force couldn't address. I chose to believe that the sacrifice of my personal life was worth saving hundreds of thousands of other people who would never know they'd been in danger. That's a rationalization, not a reason," Thomas said. "You could have rotated out after a few years, could have come home and let someone else take over, could have found a way to serve without completely abandoning everyone who loved you." James stood and moved to a small safe built into the cabin's wall, entering a combination and retrieving a thick folder that looked like it had been handled many times over the years. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing cities and buildings and people who were alive and going about their normal lives, without knowing they'd been targets of attacks that had been prevented by operations that could never be publicly acknowledged. "These are the people who didn't die because Deep Sanctuary exists," he said, spreading the photographs across his desk. "Boston in 1998, San Diego in 2001, Miami in 2007, Seattle in 2015. Each one was a planned attack that we stopped, nuclear or biological or chemical weapons that would have killed hundreds of thousands if we hadn't been operating in places we weren't officially authorized to be." Thomas looked at the photographs, seeing ordinary people in ordinary moments, completely unaware that they were documentation of attacks that hadn't happened and tragedies that had been prevented. "How many of these operations did you personally conduct?" 17 over 28 years, James answered. 17 times when the intelligence was solid enough and the threat was immediate enough that waiting for official authorization would have meant the attack succeeded. 17 times when I made the choice to violate international law and rules of engagement to prevent mass casualties. "And how many times did you think about coming home?" Thomas asked. "How many times did you consider that maybe the cost to your family was too high, that maybe someone else could carry the burden?" "Every single day," James said, his voice breaking slightly. Every birthday I missed, every Christmas, every time I saw crew members receiving letters from their families while I pretended mine was dead. I thought about coming home constantly, Thomas. But I also knew that if I came home, if I broke my cover, the entire Deep Sanctuary program would be compromised. Every officer involved would be exposed. Every family would learn their loved ones had been lying for years, and the operational capability that had prevented those 17 attacks would be destroyed. So you chose the mission over everything else, Thomas said. And now what? Now that I'm here, now that I know the truth, what happens next? Walsh spoke from her position by the door, her voice careful and measured. What happens next depends on what you want to accomplish, Mr. Graves. Your father arranged for you to find the hidden compartment on the Montana because after 28 years he wants out. He wants to come home, wants to expose Deep Sanctuary so that the officers involved can retire properly and their families can know the truth. But doing that means destroying the program's operational capability and potentially putting lives at risk if there are active threats that currently require Deep Sanctuary resources to prevent. How many active threats? Thomas asked. Walsh glanced at James before answering. Currently, we're monitoring 3 potential situations that might require intervention. None of them are immediately critical, but any of them could escalate within the next 6 to 12 months into scenarios where Deep Sanctuary's unique capabilities would be the only option for preventing significant loss of life. So if we expose the program now, people might die who could have been saved, Thomas said, understanding the impossible position his father had been living in for 3 decades. And if we don't expose it, you continue operating in secret, and all the families continue believing their loved ones are dead. That's the essential dilemma, James confirmed. And it's why I left you the photograph and the instructions to find me. Because after 28 years, I don't trust my own judgment anymore. I've been living this lie for so long that I can't objectively evaluate whether the mission is still worth the cost or whether I'm just rationalizing continued service because it's easier than facing the consequences of coming home. Thomas walked to the cabin's small porthole, looking out at the dark water that surrounded the submarine, thinking about his mother who died believing her husband had drowned, about his sister who still struggled with trust and abandonment, about the 73 other Alexandria crew members who'd made the same choice and whose families had suffered the same losses. He thought about the photographs spread across his father's desk, people who were alive because of operations that could never be acknowledged, and about the 3 potential threats that might require similar interventions in the coming months. I want to talk to the other officers, Thomas decided. I want to hear from the crew who've been living this same lie, who've sacrificed their families for the mission, and I want to understand whether they think continuing Deep Sanctuary is justified or whether they're ready to come home. Then we decide together what happens next, not just you and me making choices that affect 73 families who deserve to have a voice in this. James looked at Walsh, who nodded slowly. We can arrange that, she said. But Mr. Graves, you need to understand that not everyone aboard will agree with your father's position. There are officers who genuinely believe Deep Sanctuary is necessary and who'll fight to keep it operational, even if that means keeping you from leaving this submarine with information that could expose the program. Then they can make their arguments, Thomas said, and we'll see whether their reasons are compelling enough to justify another 28 years of families mourning men who aren't actually dead. James Graves called an assembly of the senior officers 12 hours after Thomas boarded the Seawolf, gathering 16 men in the submarine's cramped wardroom while the vessel cruised at depth through Atlantic waters that official records would never show it had entered. Thomas sat at one end of the table, his father at the other, while Walsh stood near the door with an expression that suggested she was prepared for this meeting to become confrontational and possibly dangerous, depending on how deep the divisions within Deep Sanctuary's ranks actually ran. The officers ranged in age from mid-30s to late 60s, their faces carrying the weathered look of men who'd spent decades underwater, and their eyes showed varying degrees of curiosity, hostility, and resignation as they studied Thomas with the intensity of people assessing whether he represented salvation or threat. Several of them Thomas recognized from memorial services he'd attended years ago, officers whose families had mourned them while they continued serving in secret, and the surreal experience of seeing dead men sitting around a table waiting to debate whether to continue being dead made Thomas feel like reality had become unmoored from anything that made sense. You all know why we're here, James began, his command voice filling the small space. My son found the compartment I left on the Montana, followed the instructions I provided, and reached this submarine to learn the truth about Deep Sanctuary and about why I volunteered to let my family believe I was dead for 28 years. Now we need to decide collectively whether the program continues or whether we expose it and come home, because this isn't just my decision to make. It affects every officer here and all 73 crew members who've sacrificed their personal lives for the mission. A lieutenant commander in his early 50s spoke first, his voice carrying frustration that sounded long suppressed. Captain, with respect, this shouldn't be a discussion at all. We all volunteered for Deep Sanctuary knowing the cost. We all agreed that the mission was worth the sacrifice. Bringing a civilian aboard and letting him dictate whether we continue serving is a betrayal of everything we've committed to. Thomas leaned forward, meeting the officer's hostile gaze. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, according to the records I found, you've been dead since 2003. You have a daughter who was 8 years old when you disappeared and is now 30 years old, married with children you've never met. Your family has been living with your loss for 22 years, while you've been serving on submarines conducting operations they'll never know about. Don't you think they deserve a say in whether that continues? What I think is that civilian oversight of classified military operations is exactly why programs like Deep Sanctuary are necessary in the first place. Patterson shot back. Politicians and the public don't have the stomach for the difficult decisions that keep them safe. They want security, but they don't want to know what that security costs. We bear that cost so they don't have to. Or maybe you bear that cost because it's easier than facing the families you abandoned, Thomas countered. Maybe after 20 years of living a lie, it's simpler to keep lying than to deal with the consequences of coming home. The room erupted with multiple officers speaking at once, some supporting Patterson's position and others challenging it, the debate revealing fractures that had probably existed within Deep Sanctuary for years, but had never been openly addressed. Walsh let them argue for several minutes before raising her hand for silence, her authority enough to quiet the room, though the tension remained thick enough to feel oppressive. Let's establish facts before we continue fighting, she said, pulling out a tablet and displaying data on a screen mounted to the wardroom wall. Deep Sanctuary has conducted 62 classified operations over 31 years. 17 of those operations, as Captain Graves mentioned, prevented attacks that would have killed an estimated 400,000 people total. The other 45 operations gathered intelligence, conducted surveillance, or performed deterrence missions that contributed to national security, but didn't directly prevent imminent attacks. So a quarter of what we've done actually saved lives, a younger officer said quietly. What about the other 3/4? What were we sacrificing our families for during those operations? Intelligence that prevented threats from developing, Walsh replied. Surveillance that gave policymakers information they needed to make diplomatic decisions. Deterrence operations that convinced adversaries not to pursue actions that would have required military response. All valuable, all contributing to security, but none involving the immediate life or death stakes that characterize the attack prevention missions. Thomas studied the data, seeing patterns that Walsh's presentation made clear. The frequency of actual attack preventions has been declining over the past decade, he observed. Only 3 operations in the last 10 years directly prevented imminent threats, while 42 during that same period were intelligence gathering or deterrence. The program's mission has shifted from preventing attacks to maintaining general surveillance capabilities, because the nature of threats has evolved, Patterson argued. Modern terrorism and rogue state actions are more sophisticated and harder to detect. We need persistent presence in sensitive areas to maintain the intelligence advantage that allows us to identify threats before they develop into imminent attacks. Or the threats have declined because global security has improved, and we're continuing a program that was necessary 30 years ago, but isn't justified anymore given the cost to the families involved, another officer countered, a commander in his late 40s whose name badge read, Mitchell. I've been dead since 2008. 17 years mourned by a wife who remarried, and kids who grew up calling another man dad. I believed it was worth it when we were stopping nuclear weapons from reaching American cities. I'm not sure it's worth it anymore when we're mainly conducting surveillance that conventional intelligence assets could probably handle. The debate continued for another 2 hours. Officers arguing positions they'd probably held privately for years, the room dividing roughly into 3 camps. Those who believed Deep Sanctuary remained essential regardless of cost. those who thought the program had outlived its justification and should be exposed, and those who were genuinely uncertain which position was correct. James mostly listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions but not pushing his own opinion, and Thomas realized his father was conducting this meeting not as a commander giving orders, but as someone genuinely seeking collective wisdom about an impossible decision. Finally, as the argument began circling back to points already made, James stood, and the room fell silent. "We're going to vote," he said. "Not a binding decision, because ultimately the choice about whether to expose Deep Sanctuary will be made at levels above our authority, but a clear indication of where this crew stands on the question of whether the program should continue. All officers in favor of maintaining Deep Sanctuary and continuing current operations, raise your hand." 6 hands went up, including Patterson's, roughly a third of the officers present. James counted them carefully before continuing. "All officers in favor of exposing Deep Sanctuary and retiring the program, raise your hand." 8 hands rose, including Mitchell's and several others who'd been vocal about questioning the program's continued necessity. James counted again before looking at the remaining 2 officers who'd voted for neither option. "Commander Walsh and Lieutenant Harrison, you're abstaining?" Walsh nodded. "I'm program oversight, not operational crew. My opinion shouldn't influence the vote." And Harrison, a younger officer who looked to be in his mid-30s, spoke quietly. "I've only been dead for 3 years, Captain. I don't have the perspective to judge whether 28 years of sacrifice was worth it, and I don't feel qualified to vote on a decision that affects people who've been living this lie much longer than I have." James sat back down, his expression thoughtful as he processed the results. 8 to 6 in favor of exposure, with 2 abstentions. Not an overwhelming mandate either direction, which probably reflects the actual complexity of the situation. He looked directly at Thomas. "My son came here expecting me to have clear answers about whether Deep Sanctuary was justified and whether I regret the choice I made 28 years ago. The truth is I don't have those answers. I prevented attacks that would have killed thousands of people, and I destroyed my family in the process. Both of those things are true, and I can't weigh them against each other in any objective way that determines which mattered more." "So what happens now?" Thomas asked. "If the vote is split and you don't have clear answers, how do we decide what to do?" "We go public," James said simply. "Not with operational details or classified information that would compromise national security, but with the basic truth that Deep Sanctuary exists, that it's been operating for 31 years using submarine crews who are legally dead, and that the families of those crew members deserve to know their loved ones are alive. Let Congress and the public and the military leadership debate whether the program should continue. We've been making this decision in secret for 3 decades. Maybe it's time for some transparency." "That will destroy the program's operational capability," Patterson protested. "The moment Deep Sanctuary is exposed, every operation becomes impossible because we lose the deniability that makes the missions feasible." "Yes," James agreed, "which is why this decision requires more courage than anything we've done operationally. It's easy to volunteer for dangerous missions when you believe you're protecting people. It's much harder to admit that maybe the cost was too high, and the justification was too thin, and the families we abandoned deserved better than the choice we made for them." Walsh moved to the center of the room, her expression serious. "If we proceed with public exposure, I need to warn everyone here that the consequences will be significant. Congressional investigations, potential prosecutions for officers who violated orders or laws, media scrutiny of every family involved, and the destruction of careers that many of you have built over decades. The Navy will fight to contain this, and powerful people will try to discredit or silence everyone involved. This isn't a decision to make lightly." The room fell silent as officers contemplated what exposure would actually mean. The investigations and publicity and family reunions that would be simultaneously joyful and devastating. And Thomas watched his father's face, seeing the weight of command and the burden of leadership, and the recognition that some decisions were right even when they destroyed everything you'd built. "We expose it," James said firmly. "Not because I'm certain it's the right choice, but because after 28 years of operating in secret, the families deserve truth more than we deserve to continue serving in shadows." He looked around the table at officers who'd been his brothers for decades, men who'd sacrificed everything for missions that might or might not have been worth the cost. "Draft a statement explaining Deep Sanctuary's existence and mission." contact congressional oversight committees and major news organizations, and prepare for the reality that our service, which we believed was heroic and necessary, might be judged very differently by the people we were supposedly protecting. 3 days later, Thomas stood on the deck of the Seawolf as the submarine surfaced 30 miles off Virginia Beach, close enough to shore that news helicopters and Coast Guard vessels were already approaching, summoned by the statement James had released through secure channels to media organizations and congressional offices. The statement had been brief and carefully worded, explaining that Deep Sanctuary had operated for 31 years using volunteer submarine crews who'd faked their deaths to conduct classified operations, that the program had prevented multiple terrorist attacks but had also imposed devastating costs on the families of participating officers, and that the crew of USS Seawolf was voluntarily surrendering and requesting proper retirement procedures that would allow them to return to civilian life. The response had been immediate and overwhelming. Congressional leaders calling for investigations, Navy officials issuing carefully worded statements that neither confirmed nor denied the program's existence, and families of supposedly deceased submarine officers flooding media outlets with questions and demands for answers. Thomas's phone, which had finally regained signal as they approached shore, was overwhelmed with messages from journalists and government officials, and his sister Sarah, who'd sent a single text that read simply, "Is it true? Is Dad alive?" James stood next to Thomas on the deck, wearing his submarine officer's uniform for what would likely be the last time, watching the approaching vessels with an expression that mixed relief and apprehension and exhaustion that came from 3 decades of carrying secrets. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked. "Ready for the investigations and publicity and all the questions you'll have to answer?" "I stopped being ready for anything the moment I volunteered for Deep Sanctuary in 1996, James replied. "But ready or not, it's time to face what I did and accept whatever consequences come from the choice I made." The Coast Guard cutter reached them first, its crew professional and uncertain as they approached a submarine that was supposed to be decommissioned but was clearly operational, crewed by officers who were supposed to be dead but were visibly alive. A voice over the cutter's loudspeaker called out, "USS Seawolf, this is Coast Guard cutter Barracuda. You are ordered to follow us to Norfolk Naval Station, where you will surrender your vessel and your crew will be taken into federal custody, pending investigation. Acknowledge these orders." James picked up a radio handset and responded with calm authority. "Barracuda, this is Captain James Graves, Commanding Officer USS Seawolf. We acknowledge your orders and will comply fully with all lawful instructions. I request that congressional oversight representatives and media witnesses be present at Norfolk to ensure transparency throughout the surrender process. We have nothing to hide anymore." 6 months later, Thomas sat in a congressional hearing room watching his father testify before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, answering questions about Deep Sanctuary with the same straightforward honesty that had characterized his statement when the Seawolf had surfaced. The hearings had been ongoing for weeks, revealing details about 31 years of classified operations, examining the legal and ethical implications of a program that had operated outside normal oversight, and trying to determine whether the officers involved were heroes or criminals or something complicated that didn't fit neatly into either category. The investigations had revealed that Deep Sanctuary had indeed prevented 17 major attacks as James had claimed, and that the intelligence gathered during other operations had contributed significantly to national security. But they'd also revealed that several operations had violated international law, that congressional oversight had been deliberately circumvented, and that families had been lied to in ways that caused measurable psychological damage across multiple generations. 73 submarine officers had come forward, reuniting with families in scenes that were simultaneously joyful and traumatic. 31 years of loss and grief and abandonment issues that couldn't be erased by explanations about national security and necessary sacrifices. Thomas's sister Sarah had spent 2 weeks refusing to speak to their father before finally agreeing to meet him, and their reunion had involved more tears and anger and complicated emotions than Thomas had known how to process. The committee's final recommendation, released after 6 months of investigation, was predictably nuanced and politically careful. Deep Sanctuary had operated in legal gray areas that required new legislation to prevent future programs from similarly circumventing oversight. The officers involved had acted from genuine belief in their mission, but had also made choices that caused harm requiring acknowledgement and compensation. The program would be permanently terminated. All surviving personnel would receive honorable discharges and full retirement benefits, and families would receive both financial compensation and access to counseling services to help process the trauma of learning their loved ones had been alive while they'd been mourning. Thomas and his father had dinner together that evening at a restaurant in Washington, their first meal in public since the Seawolf had surrendered, and the normalcy of ordering food and making small talk felt surreal after everything that had happened. Was it worth it? Thomas finally asked. 28 years of sacrifice, 17 attacks prevented, all those families destroyed. Looking back now, was the mission worth the cost? James was quiet for a long time, his food mostly untouched, his eyes carrying the weight of 3 decades of impossible decisions. I honestly don't know, he admitted. I know that 400,000 people are alive because of operations Deep Sanctuary conducted. I also know that 73 families were traumatized by lies we told to protect operational security. Both of those facts are true, and I don't have the wisdom or perspective to determine which one matters more. Maybe that's the real answer, Thomas said. Maybe some choices are too big to judge, too complicated to reduce to simple calculations about whether the ends justified the means. Maybe the best we can do is acknowledge both the good that came from Deep Sanctuary and the harm it caused, and accept that you were trying to do the right thing even if the cost was higher than anyone should have had to pay. James reached across the table and gripped Thomas's hand, the first physical contact they'd had beyond brief embraces during the chaos of the past 6 months. Thank you for finding me, he said quietly. Thank you for having the courage to board that submarine and force us to confront what we'd become. If you hadn't bought the Montana, if you hadn't found that compartment, I think I would have stayed dead forever because I didn't have the strength to come home on my own. You left me the photograph and the note, Thomas reminded him. You made sure I'd find the compartment. That took strength too. It took desperation, James corrected. After 28 years, I was desperate enough to risk exposure, because continuing the lie was killing me even though I was technically alive. But you're the one who actually finished it, who took the risk and made the journey, and forced the conversation that ended Deep Sanctuary. That's courage I'm not sure I would have had if our positions were reversed. They finished dinner and walked out into Washington evening air that felt impossibly normal, given everything that had happened. 2 men trying to build a relationship from fragments of memory and decades of separation, trying to find common ground between the person James had been before Deep Sanctuary and the person he'd become during 31 years of living in secret. It wasn't easy, and Thomas knew it wouldn't get easier quickly, but it was real in ways that the lies had never been, and that authenticity felt like something worth preserving even when it was complicated and painful, and didn't resolve into neat endings. He'd bought a submarine for $600,000 and found a room the Navy never listed, a hidden compartment that contained his father's life, and his family's truth and secrets that had been buried for longer than some of the submarine's crew had been alive. The discovery had exposed a classified program, reunited 73 families, and forced conversations about security and sacrifice and the prices people paid in shadows, so others could live in light. Whether it had been worth it, whether Deep Sanctuary's mission had justified its costs, those were questions that history would debate, and different people would answer differently depending on their values and experiences, and understanding of what made sacrifice noble versus what made it tragic. But Thomas knew one thing with absolute certainty as he walked through Washington with his father beside him, alive and real, and no longer a ghost haunting memories and memorial services. The truth, however complicated and uncomfortable and difficult to process, was better than the most carefully constructed lie, and families deserved that truth even when it hurt, because healing could only begin with honesty, and reunion could only happen when people stopped pretending that dead men were actually dead, and living men were actually living the lives they claimed to be living. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into classified programs, impossible choices, and the complicated truth about sacrifice and service. If this story made you think about the costs of security and the importance of transparency, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more true stories that explore the gray areas where duty and family intersect in ways that have no easy answers. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on whether programs like Deep Sanctuary can ever be justified. And remember that the truth, however painful, is always worth pursuing even when powerful people would prefer it stayed buried forever.